In mid-1942, the fighting around Papua and the Solomon Sea was shaped by competing requirements that were operational rather than symbolic. Airfields close enough to project fighter cover, anchorages that could sustain barge or small ship traffic, and observation points that could provide warning along narrow sea lanes. After Japan's rapid expansion early in the year, the objective in the New Guinea Solomon sector was to secure the approaches to Rabaul and protect lines of communication while applying pressure toward Port Moresby by sea and overland. For the Allied side, the priority was to hold Port Moresby, prevent a Japanese lodgment on the southeastern tip of New Guinea, and keep open the maritime route that linked Australia to forward bases in Papua. Two events in August 1942 tightened this contest. On the 7th of August, Allied landings on Guadalcanal forced Japan to allocate attention and shipping to the Solomons, complicating planned operations elsewhere. In the same month, Japan proceeded with an attempt to seize Milne Bay at the eastern end of Papua, aiming to take its airstrips and anchorage and thereby threaten Allied movement through the Solomon Sea. Australian and U.S. units at Milne Bay anticipated a landing, but faced the practical difficulty that, without strong coastal surveillance equipment, many enemy movements could only be answered once detected and reported. Goodenough Island entered this operational picture because of its position on the sea route between Milne Bay and the Buna area on the New Guinea mainland, and because it contained flat ground suitable for emergency airstrips alongside a small number of usable anchorages. The island lies in the d'Entrecasteaux group, separated from nearby islands by straits and reefs that restricted navigation for larger ships and made small craft movement comparatively important. Its interior is mountainous, while parts of the coastal belt include grassland and swamp, limiting movement off the beaches and concentrating traffic through a few tracks and villages. For both sides, this meant that even a small force on Goodenough could influence reconnaissance, warning, and small ship movement along a corridor that aircraft and shipping had to traverse. In early August, the Allied side treated Goodenough less as an objective than as a listening post. A small American detachment was placed there to provide advance warning to Australian fighters based at Milne Bay. The island's isolation also made it a practical refuge for aircraft in distress. During the opening days of the Guadalcanal landings, several RAAF P-40s made forced landings on the grassy plains and departed after makeshift strips were cut. These episodes illustrate the pre-battle role of Goodenough as infrastructure in waiting, not yet a base, but a location with immediate tactical utility. From the Japanese perspective, the island became significant through contingency rather than design. During the Milne Bay operation, a detachment of about 353 Special Naval Landing Force troops under Commander Torashige Tsukioka, supplemented by small engineer elements, moved by landing craft in late August 1942, but was discovered and struck from the air, losing its craft, radio, and much of its stores, leaving the survivors stranded on Goodenough. The presence of a marooned force created a practical dilemma for Japanese commanders: abandon trained personnel and equipment, or risk scarce destroyers and aircraft in a rescue attempt along a route exposed to Allied air attack. Allied air and naval forces, for their part, treated Japanese small ship movement in this region as an indicator of broader intent, either renewed effort toward Milne Bay or preparations connected to the Buna area, making interdiction a way to shape future operations rather than merely respond to the past. By late September and October 1942, the continued existence of a Japanese pocket on Goodenough had implications beyond the number of men involved. For Allied planners preparing to contest Japanese positions on the New Guinea mainland, an enemy-held or enemy-used island on the Milne Bay-Buna sea line represented a risk of surveillance, raiding, and harassment against small shipping and aircraft routes. For Japanese forces, the stranded detachment was simultaneously a liability, short of resupply and exposed to air attack, and a potential outpost that could watch Allied movement if it could be sustained or extracted on favorable terms. Local island communities, administered under wartime Australian authority, experienced these dynamics as a direct security and displacement problem, The arrival of armed parties and the prospect of air attack and patrols threatened villages and movement between islands even before a formal landing operation began. By October 1942, Allied planning in the Southwest Pacific area was shifting from local defense to a staged advance toward the Bunagona coast. Within that framework, General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters treated Goodenough Island as a flank security problem. Any Japanese presence astride the Milne Bay-Buna sea route could observe or raid light shipping and complicate the movement of forces and stores needed for the coming operations on the New Guinea mainland. The decision translated into a short-notice amphibious move assigned to an Australian infantry unit already in the Milne Bay area. The 212th Infantry Battalion of the 18th Brigade was tasked to land, clear the island, and restore warning and coast-watching functions while reconnoitering sites for potential air facilities. The compressed timeline shaped the opening phase. Higher headquarters issued orders only days before execution. Joint planning was constrained by the late arrival of naval assets, and there was no time for rehearsal landings or specialized amphibious training. Naval lift and landing means were limited. 2 Royal Australian Navy destroyers, HMAS Arunta and HMAS Stewart, were employed as fast transports and escorts, supplemented by small local vessels, and a small number of captured Japanese landing craft recovered after earlier fighting in the Milne Bay area. This combination dictated what could be carried ashore. The landing force was reduced to a light infantry scale with medical support, minimal mortar firepower, and strict ration loads because vehicles and heavy stores could not be landed or moved on the island's track network. On the night of 22nd October 1942, the battalion embarked and moved from Milne Bay to Goodenough Island. The landing plan split the force to bracket the island's southern approaches. The main body, under Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Arnold, went ashore at Mud Bay, while a smaller detachment, largely from C Company under Major Keith Gategood, landed at Taliba Bay several miles away. The intention was to compress Japanese movement toward the known concentration of troops around the Keelia Mission and adjacent coastal belt, limiting escape routes and forcing contact on Allied terms. For the Japanese detachment under Commander Torashige Tsukioka, the opening phase was defined by endurance and concealment rather than maneuver. By late October, the force had had time to prepare defensive positions around likely approaches, while also dealing with diminishing supplies, disease pressure, and the expectation that any attempt to hold ground would be constrained by the possibility of evacuation rather than reinforcement. The tactical advantage lay in choosing where to reveal positions. Allowing an opponent to enter close terrain before opening fire could offset disadvantages in numbers and logistics. After midnight, the Mud Bay group established a beach base for casualties and stores, and then moved inland in heavy rain, guided by Papuan policemen. At first light on the 23rd of October, elements advancing toward Keelia met prepared Japanese defenses on high ground overlooking a creek crossing, where machine gun and mortar fire fixed the lead troops and grenades were used against men caught in the open. On the opposite side of the southern tip, Gategood's Taliba Bay detachment faced similar constraints: difficult movement, limited communications, and the risk that piecemeal contact would prevent the two landing groups from supporting each other at decisive moments. A failure in the power supply for radios further weakened coordination, and promised air support did not materialize as planned. Instead, Japanese aircraft strafed Australian positions and the vessels at anchor, creating additional casualties and reinforcing the vulnerability of the improvised beachhead system. These first hours set the character of the engagement: an Allied force attempting to close and clear under severe mobility and communications limits, and a Japanese force using prepared terrain and short, intense fire to delay, preserve cohesion, and create time for withdrawal options. The opening phase ended with both sides adjusting to the immediate realities ashore: visibility, weather, navigation, and the fragility of supporting arms, before the battle's outcome would be decided by whether contact could be renewed on favorable terms or broken entirely. For Allied headquarters in October 1942, Goodenough Island was not treated as an isolated objective. It was integrated into the operational design for the Bunagona campaign, where multiple lines of advance were expected to converge on the Japanese beachhead. One of those lines required coastal movement and light shipping along the North and East Papuan approaches, and that traffic had to pass close to Goodenough. A Japanese-held observation point there could report movements, interfere with small craft, or support air and barge activity between the D'Entrecasteaux Islands and the New Guinea mainland. The Allied intent was therefore preventative: occupy the island to deny its use, restore early warning, and create the option of an emergency or forward air facility that could support reconnaissance and local air cover. The directive translated into a limited, risk-managed operation rather than a heavy assault. The designated landing force was the Australian 2nd 12th Infantry Battalion of the 18th Brigade, reinforced with small specialist and support detachments, totaling about 640 personnel for the initial landing group. The battalion was chosen because it was already positioned at Milne Bay after recent operations, and because the available lift could not move a larger combined arms package. The operational orders assigned 3 concrete tasks: destroy or expel the Japanese detachment on the island, re-establish coast watching and air warning functions, and reconnoiter terrain and approaches for future supply and airfield development. These priorities shaped everything else, including the decision to accept a lighter weapons scale than would have been preferred for a deliberate attack on prepared positions. Logistics drove the plan as much as intelligence did. The amphibious means on hand were improvised. 2 Royal Australian Navy destroyers were used to move the battalion across from Milne Bay, and the landing itself relied on small boats and ship's craft. This imposed strict limits on heavy equipment, ammunition reserves, and medical evacuation capacity. The landing force could carry mortars and machine guns, but not vehicles, artillery, or the engineering plant that would normally be used to open roads or rapidly build a defended base area. Communications were planned around portable radio sets dependent on a small generator for sustained power at the beachhead, a vulnerability that mattered because the landing was split between 2 bays with difficult ground between them. Intelligence estimates influenced but did not eliminate uncertainty. Reports indicated roughly 300 Japanese troops concentrated around the Galawao Bay Kelia mission area, with limited food and ammunition and widespread sickness. This suggested that the Japanese might choose withdrawal rather than a static defense if pressed, but it did not guarantee minimal resistance. A smaller force in dense terrain could still delay an attacker, inflict casualties, and then disengage under cover of darkness. Allied planners therefore aimed to land at night and apply pressure quickly from more than one direction to prevent the Japanese from slipping away without contact. Japanese decision-making began from a different problem set. The troops on Goodenough were not originally intended as an independent garrison. They were a detachment of the 5th Sasebo Special Naval Landing Force, and supporting personnel that had been stranded after their landing craft were destroyed by air attack during the Milne Bay operation. The immediate Japanese objective became survival and extraction, while preserving enough cohesion to avoid capture and maintain the ability to fight if a rescue or breakout became possible. Their higher command at Rabaul faced a cost comparison. Sending destroyers or additional aircraft into waters exposed to Allied air power risked scarce assets, but leaving trained troops behind carried its own operational and morale costs. Resupply and evacuation planning reflected that balance. The Japanese attempted to sustain the detachment by airdrops and then by submarine delivery. On October 3rd, a submarine delivered rations, ammunition, medical supplies, a radio, and a landing craft, and evacuated 71 sick or wounded men and recovered remains. After that evacuation, the Japanese strength on the island during the later ground fighting was about 285. A second submarine run on 13 October brought more supplies and another landing craft, but was disrupted by Allied air activity, reinforcing the assessment that any surface extraction would be hazardous. By mid-October, Japanese signals warned the detachment that Allied interest in Goodenough was increasing, and that an invasion was likely, pushing the local commander toward preparations for a delaying defense and a planned withdrawal route. Thus, by October 22nd, both sides approached the coming engagement with constrained options. The Allies planned to achieve denial and reconnaissance with a light force delivered by limited naval lift, accepting risk in firepower and communications to act quickly before the Buna campaign required the same units elsewhere. The Japanese planned to preserve what remained of a stranded detachment, using the island's terrain to slow any landing force while keeping open the possibility of escape by small craft toward nearby islands. The first contact on Goodenough Island followed an Allied landing plan shaped by lift limits and terrain rather than by overwhelming supporting fire. On the night of 22nd to 23rd October 1942, the 212th Infantry Battalion moved from Milne Bay to the island in two Royal Australian Navy destroyers, HMAS Arunta and HMAS Stewart. The battalion was split between two landing points on the southern end of the island. A main group under Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Arnold landed at Mud Bay at about 2300 hours on 22nd October, while a smaller group under Major Keith Gategood landed at Taliba Bay at about 3:30 hours on 23rd October. The intent was to apply pressure from separated approaches against the reported Japanese concentration around the Galaiwao Bay-Kelia mission area. At Mud Bay, the landing force established a temporary base area for stores and casualties. Because boats and ships' craft limited what could be carried forward, the battalion cached heavier equipment near the beach and moved inland with reduced loads. The march toward Kelia began in darkness, with guides from local Papuan police. A thunderstorm and heavy rain began after the force left the beach area, slowing movement over steep ground and limiting visibility. By morning, the leading elements were still short of Kelia when they reached a creek crossing overlooked by higher ground. Commander Torishige Tsukioka's Japanese detachment had prepared to use the island's narrow movement corridors and high ground to delay an advance. Around 8:30 on 23rd October, as Australian troops crossed the creek and began to climb toward the next rise, Tsukioka's men opened fire with machine guns and mortars at close range. The timing concentrated effect. Troops already across the creek were exposed to grenades rolled down from the slope, while troops still behind the creek were pinned by sustained fire that restricted both movement and evacuation of the wounded. The Australian advance stopped at the crossing and immediate approaches, and Arnold ordered a withdrawal to prevent the force being fixed under fire on unfavorable ground. That withdrawal did not end contact. During the night of October 23rd to 24th, the Mud Bay group established a defensive position and repelled a small Japanese attack. Neither side attempted a decisive pursuit in darkness and heavy vegetation. For the Australians, the priority became restoring cohesion, maintaining a protected route back to the beach base, and re-establishing communications for coordination and support. For the Japanese, limited manpower and supplies favored short engagements designed to create delay and casualties without becoming tied to a prolonged close-range fight. The Taliba Bay landing developed differently, but ended in the same operational problem. The separated groups could not reliably support each other once contact began. After landing at about 3:30 on 23rd October, Gategood's detachment captured a Japanese machine gun position around 6 o'clock, then pushed south with two platoons. The Australians drove Japanese elements back beyond the Nubaloo Creek area, but at about 900 hours, the Japanese mounted a counterattack from the north. The counterattack inflicted casualties and forced the Australians to withdraw from exposed positions. Gategood attempted to break radio silence to coordinate with Arnold, but communications failed to connect between the separated landing forces. The communications breakdown was not only a matter of distance and terrain. The radios supporting the Mud Bay base depended on a petrol generator, and when it failed, Arnold's group lost its primary link to Milne Bay command elements and to the Taliba Bay detachment. The immediate effect was that each landing group fought and regrouped largely on its own information, without a synchronized plan for converging on Kelia or for concentrating mortar support at a decisive moment. Supporting arms also did not develop as planned. On October 24th, Arnold initiated another attempt toward Kelia, supported by mortars, but an expected airstrike did not arrive. Instead, Japanese aircraft strafed Australian positions and the vessels and craft near Mud Bay, including areas where wounded personnel were being handled. This added casualties and reinforced a constraint present from the first night. With destroyers and small craft exposed near shore, the beach base could not function like a secure port. Evacuation, resupply, and command arrangements all depended on short windows of relative safety. By the end of 24 October, the opening engagements had produced 3 operational outcomes without deciding the island's control. First, the Japanese had shown they could impose delay and casualties from prepared ground near the main approach to Kelia. Second, the Australians had demonstrated they could land at night and sustain a beach base, but their split landing and fragile communications made rapid concentration difficult. Third, the civilian environment was already being affected by the mechanics of fighting. Movement by local people became constrained by patrols, firing, and air activity near villages and tracks, while Australian reliance on local guides underscored that the terrain and settlement pattern mattered as much as the order of battle. The clash therefore entered its next phase, with both sides adjusting. The Australians had to decide whether to press frontal approaches against known defensive ground or to reconfigure the advance to restore coordination and reduce exposure to ambush at creek crossings and slopes. The Japanese had to decide whether to continue delaying actions at Kelia, attempt withdrawal while the Australians were not yet fully synchronized, or seek extraction by small craft under the risk of air attack. By 24th October 1942, the operation shifted from dispersed probing to a consolidation problem under fire. The Talaba Bay detachment had been forced back after losing 6 killed, 10 wounded, and 3 listed as missing during the fighting around Nubaloo Creek, and the immediate priority became concentrating the battalion at Mud Bay to prevent either landing group being defeated in detail. The withdrawal also meant that the original intent to compress the Japanese from 2 directions was no longer feasible. The battalion would have to advance again along the same constrained approaches that had already revealed prepared Japanese positions. Command and control became the central constraint. Drake Force relied on 2 AWA-3B wireless sets to maintain contact with Milne Bay, with additional sets to link battalion headquarters to the beach base and companies forward. The petrol generator at Mud Bay that supplied power to the radios failed, severing Arnold's link with Milne Bay and removing the practical means to coordinate air support, request naval gunfire if available, or control the movement of elements operating beyond visual contact in jungle and broken ground. In terrain where small navigation errors could separate units by hundreds of meters without line of sight, a loss of communications carried the same weight as a loss of fire support. At 9:10 on 24th October, Arnold attempted to restart the advance on Kelia with the limited heavy weapons that could be carried forward from the beach base, 2 3-inch mortars and about 100 rounds brought up from Mud Bay. The plan assumed an airstrike would suppress key positions, but the strike did not arrive. Instead, Japanese aircraft strafed Australian positions and the improvised naval and shore facilities at Mud Bay, including the Ketch McLaren King, which was carrying wounded men. This imposed an immediate medical and logistical crisis. The beach base was both the supply point and the casualty handling point, and it was exposed to air attack without dedicated anti-aircraft defense. Arnold also attempted a flanking movement with A Company to avoid another frontal approach into the same kill zones. The maneuver failed for a reason common to small unit operations in this environment. The company became disoriented in dense jungle where tracks were few, landmarks were inconsistent across maps, and navigation depended on local knowledge and short-range bearings. The battalion therefore faced a binary choice in real time: press a frontal attack against the main Japanese defenses with limited mortar ammunition and uncertain communications, or hold and reorganize. Arnold chose not to force the frontal assault. For Tsukioka's Japanese detachment, these hours presented a different crisis and opportunity. The force had been on the island since late August, reduced to about 285 men during the ground fighting after earlier submarine evacuation of sick and wounded. Malaria and limited stores meant that prolonging the engagement would worsen the balance even if the defenders could hold ground tactically. The air activity over Mud Bay also clarified that remaining near the southern anchorages increased exposure to Allied aircraft. During the night of 24th to 25th October, the Japanese executed a withdrawal rather than continue a static defense. They used 2 landing craft to transport men, equipment, and supplies to Ferguson Island, arriving at dawn on the 25th of October. From there, 261 men were collected by the Japanese light cruiser Tenryu the following day, transferring the surviving detachment back into the wider, Rabaul-based system. For the Australians, the Japanese withdrawal removed the immediate threat, but not the operational uncertainty. A force could depart at night and still leave small groups behind, set ambushes on likely pursuit routes, or attempt to delay clearance through hidden positions. The 2nd Battalion, 12th Regiment, therefore, had to convert a contested landing into verified control by patrolling forward through Kilia and along the coastal belt toward Galloway Bay. When the advance went in, it met no resistance but found well-prepared defensive works that were now unmanned, indicating that the earlier contact had occurred at positions chosen for delay rather than for a final stand. Civilian impact escalated alongside the military crisis. Allied air activity in support of the operation included bombing and strafing in the village areas, and about 600 Goodenough Islanders fled across the strait to Ferguson Island. There, an Australian New Guinea Administrative Unit detachment established a refugee camp and maintained care until the fighting ended and return became feasible. In practical terms, the battle created a short, intense displacement event driven by fear of air attack, patrol movement near settlements, and the collapse of normal coastal travel during the days when the island's anchorages and tracks were treated as military infrastructure. By the end of this phase, the operation had become less a question of winning a set-piece fight, and more a race between verification and vulnerability. The Australians needed to confirm the island was cleared, while their beach base remained exposed and their communications fragile. The Japanese needed to extract a reduced detachment before sickness and interdiction made evacuation impossible. The highest intensity phase of the operation did not end the moment Japanese landing craft departed the island. For the Australian commander, the immediate requirement after October 25, 1942, was to verify control in practical terms, locate any remaining Japanese groups, secure the tracks and anchorages that mattered for movement, and re-establish a functioning coastal warning and patrol system. That meant shifting from a landing battle to a clearance routine in terrain, where a small number of men could remain concealed for weeks, and where contact might occur at close range without advance warning. Over the days that followed, Australian patrols pushed beyond the Kilia area toward Galloway Bay and along the coastal belt, examining prepared Japanese positions that had been abandoned. The works indicated the defensive logic used during the initial engagements: fields of fire oriented on creek crossings and short approaches, shallow entrenchments and weapon pits placed on rises overlooking movement corridors, and fallback positions designed to delay rather than to hold indefinitely. For the Australians, these findings informed how future patrols were conducted: emphasis on flanking movement, tighter control of spacing and vegetation, and maintaining reliable routes back to the beach base for casualties. The casualty picture clarified only after the fighting subsided. Australian losses for the operation were 13 killed in action, or who later died of wounds, and 19 wounded. Japanese losses were recorded as 20 killed and 15 wounded during the fighting. Australian troops also estimated higher Japanese fatalities, including an estimate of 39 dead, but the number could not be verified because Japanese troops had retrieved and buried some bodies, limiting what the Australians could confirm. These figures captured the asymmetry of the encounter. The Australians had the ability to land and sustain a presence, while the Japanese detachment, reduced by sickness and supply limits, had chosen a short delaying battle and then evacuation, leaving the Australians to convert a tactical outcome into durable control. From the Japanese perspective, the peak was defined by the timing of withdrawal under pressure, rather than by a final defensive stand. The detachment's calculations were shaped by constraints that did not change with tactical skill: limited food and medical supplies, the risk of air attack on any movement near the beaches, and the improbability of reinforcement. The evacuation to Ferguson Island and collection by a light cruiser restored most survivors to the Rabaul-based system, but it also implied acceptance that Goodenough could not be held with the resources allocated in late 1942, especially when Japanese operational priorities were expanding in the Solomons and on the New Guinea mainland. For the local population, the operational peak was experienced through exposure rather than through battle outcomes. Allied bombing and strafing near villages and tracks contributed to the flight of about 600 islanders to Ferguson Island, where Australian New Guinea Administrative Unit personnel established a refugee camp and maintained care until return was judged safe. The disruption was not limited to the days of firing, patrol movement, the presence of armed groups, and the uncertainty of further air attacks altered normal travel between settlements and across the straits, temporarily reshaping the island's social and economic routines. The clearance phase also revealed that evacuation had not removed every Japanese soldier. One Japanese soldier was captured by islanders on October 30th and handed over to Australian authorities. 2 others died from malaria during November 1942, indicating the same disease pressure that had affected the detachment earlier. Another soldier, Shigeki Yokota, avoided capture for months and was not taken prisoner until July 1943, demonstrating that even after a formal end to fighting, the practical process of control could continue in fragmented and unpredictable ways. By late 1942, the Australian force on Goodenough was no longer conducting assault actions, but it was still operating under operational urgency. The 2nd Battalion remained on the island until the 28th of December, balancing garrison duties with the broader requirement to prepare for redeployment to the Buna Sanananda fighting on the New Guinea mainland. In that sense, the peak of the Goodenough operation was not a single climactic engagement, but the short period in which a landing force had to fight, reorganize, confirm clearance, manage civilian displacement, and then transition the island from contested ground into a controlled outpost within an active theater. After the Japanese withdrawal, Allied control of Goodenough Island depended on whether the occupation could be made durable with limited troops, weak port facilities, and the expectation of Japanese air reconnaissance. 2 United States officers, one from the Air Corps and one from the Corps of Engineers, had landed with the Australian force to identify airbase and warning sites, and they judged the flats near Vivagani and Wadaluma suitable for rapid development. Local laborers cleared the Vivagani area to create an emergency fighter strip about 4,000 feet long and 100 feet wide, intended to give Allied aircraft a fallback landing option and to extend surveillance coverage across the Solomon Sea approaches. The next step was an attempt to convert that emergency strip into a heavy air-capable base. The 1st Battalion, 91st Engineer General Service Regiment, was tasked to develop Vivagani as a major airfield able to handle heavy bombers, but the plan collided with competing priorities and limited resources. The American engineers were withdrawn to Port Moresby, and the larger construction program had to be postponed. In late December 1942, the 212th Infantry Battalion departed for the Buna fighting, leaving a small residual occupation party behind, rather than a full battalion garrison. This imbalance created a classic adaptation problem. The island's strategic value increased faster than the number of troops available to hold it. The Australian occupation force responded with deception and camouflage designed to shape Japanese assessments rather than to fight a conventional defense. They fabricated dummy facilities to suggest a much larger garrison, including a mock hospital, imitation anti-aircraft guns made from logs, and vine barricades arranged to resemble barbed wire. They also lit multiple fires to simulate large-scale cooking areas, and transmitted radio traffic in deliberately weak codes consistent with a brigade-level formation, aiming to persuade Japanese observers and signals intelligence that a costly assault would be required. From the Japanese side, adaptation was visible in what did not happen. After the October evacuation, Japanese commanders avoided committing major surface assets to reoccupy the island in the face of Allied air power in the Milne Bay area and the growing demands of the Guadalcanal campaign. Japanese air activity remained a threat to exposed anchorages, but the operational pattern shifted toward economizing resources, accepting the loss of an outpost rather than escalating a fight that would require destroyers, air cover, and sustained supply runs through contested waters. On the ground, the post-battle environment still contained resistance in the narrowest sense. A small number of Japanese soldiers remained concealed, surviving on the margins of the island's interior and coastal villages for months. Their endurance reflected the same constraints that had shaped the detachment earlier: disease, isolation, and limited resupply. And it also imposed continuing security requirements on the garrison and on local communities that could encounter armed men unexpectedly while gardening, fishing, or traveling between settlements. By early 1943, Allied adaptation shifted from illusion to infrastructure. A new garrison, the Australian 47th Infantry Battalion, arrived from Milne Bay on the 4th of March 1943, under Lieutenant Colonel Henry Tasker. Drake Force expanded into a combined garrison that included a company of the 4th Field Ambulance, C Troop of the 2nd 10th Field Battery, B Troop of the 2nd 17th Light Anti-Aircraft Battery, a section of the 11th Field Company, and support detachments for signals, workshops, and camouflage. The mix reflected a practical logic: medical support for disease and accidents, limited artillery for perimeter defense, light anti-aircraft protection against strafing, and engineers to accelerate airfield and wharf work. Airfield construction then became the central form of operational adaptation. RAAF Mobile Works units expanded dispersal areas and forward field facilities at Vivagani as the base transitioned from an emergency strip into an operational air station, supporting offensive sorties against Japanese shipping and positions in the wider New Guinea and New Britain theater. The momentum shift on Goodenough Island did not come from a single sustained engagement, but from a decision cycle compressed into roughly 48 hours. Whether the Japanese detachment would remain fixed to defensive ground around Kilia or abandon the island before it became a trap, and whether the Australian landing force would accept the operational risks of staying long enough to confirm clearance and establish a usable foothold. For Commander Torashige Tsukioka, the turning point emerged after the first day of fighting on 23 October 1942. His force had imposed delay from prepared positions and had demonstrated that creek crossings and narrow approaches could be covered by machine guns, grenades, and mortars. But the engagement also exposed the limits of continuing. His detachment had been stranded since late August, its strength already reduced by sickness and prior evacuation, and its resupply prospects remained uncertain under Allied air interdiction. A prolonged defense would increase losses from disease and attrition while offering no realistic path to reinforcement. That logic favored withdrawal, while the Australians were still reorganizing, and before coastal movement corridors became tightly patrolled. The Japanese evacuation executed on the night of 24th to 25th October converted that logic into action. 2 landing craft carried men, equipment, and remaining supplies across to Ferguson Island, arriving around dawn on 25th October. On 26th October, 261 of the survivors were recovered by the light cruiser Tenryu and moved back toward Japanese-controlled bases. The action did not erase the earlier casualties or the short tactical exchanges, but it changed the nature of the operation. The Japanese detachment's objective shifted from holding terrain to preserving personnel, while Allied objectives shifted from fighting a defending force to proving the absence of one. For Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Arnold in the 212 Infantry Battalion, the same nights produced a different form of turning point. The battalion had landed with limited lift, minimal heavy equipment, and fragile communications, and it had suffered disruption from Japanese fire, navigation difficulties, and air strafing near the beach base. The immediate choice after the 25th of October was therefore operationally practical. Either withdraw quickly to reduce exposure, leaving uncertainty about lingering Japanese groups, or remain long enough to patrol, secure the movement routes, and start the conversion of the island into a controlled outpost. Arnold's battalion chose to stay, pushing patrols through the Kilia area and along the southern coastal belt to confirm that the prepared defenses were abandoned and that organized resistance had ended. This shift mattered because it altered what Goodenough represented in the theater. Before 25th of October, the island functioned as a contested point that could interrupt shipping and observation along the Milne Bay New Guinea route. After the evacuation and clearance, it became a position the Allies could use to reduce uncertainty along that corridor, an island where coast watching could be restored, where small craft could shelter under controlled conditions, and where an emergency landing strip could be maintained or expanded. These outcomes did not require a large garrison in late 1942, but they did require continuity of presence and the ability to move small quantities of supplies despite air threat. For civilians, the turning point was experienced through displacement and return. During the period of fighting and air activity, several hundred islanders moved to Ferguson Island under wartime administrative supervision. Once the absence of organized Japanese resistance became clear and patrols stabilized the coastal areas, the basis for return and resumption of normal movement improved, even as the island remained militarized and subject to continued patrols for remaining individuals. In Japanese operational terms, the evacuation implied a prioritization decision. Recovering the stranded detachment reduced the burden of supplying isolated personnel and avoided committing additional surface forces to an exposed island position at a time when Japanese shipping and air resources were being drawn into multiple demands. In Allied terms, holding the island after the landing created an option set. It removed a surveillance and raiding risk from the sea lanes near Milne Bay and provided a location that could support later airfield and garrison development as the New Guinea campaign expanded. Thus, the turning point was less a battlefield reversal than a change in feasible choices. Once the Japanese detachment broke contact and left in late October 1942, the island's status shifted from contested ground to managed ground, and subsequent events would be driven primarily by how quickly the occupying side could turn that control into infrastructure and sustained coverage. With organized Japanese resistance ended after the night withdrawal of October 24th to 25th, 1942. The operation entered a phase defined by verification, casualty handling, and the practical mechanics of leaving an island that still lay inside an active air and sea combat zone. For the Australian force, the end of combat operations was not marked by a formal surrender. It was established through patrol reports, searches of defensive positions, and the absence of coordinated fire or movement by the opposing detachment. Australian platoons moved through the Keelia mission area and adjacent tracks to confirm that previously defended ground was now empty. They inspected weapon pits, covered approaches, and temporary campsites to determine whether a rearguard remained. The fact that prepared positions had been abandoned rather than destroyed in place shaped the clearance method. Slow movement, flank security at creek crossings, and repeated checks of likely concealment areas near villages and garden clearings. The aim was not only to prevent renewed contact, but to rule out the possibility that small groups could operate against the beach base or local movement. Medical evacuation and recovery became an immediate priority. The battalion had sustained fatalities and wounded during the first engagements and subsequent air strafing near Mud Bay. Evacuation capacity depended on the same fragile shoreline system used for supply. Small craft shuttled casualties to vessels offshore, and movements had to be timed to reduce exposure to aircraft. Wounded handling, therefore, remained tied to weather, sea state, and the ability to keep boats operating under threat. The battalion also recovered equipment and redistributed ammunition from forward elements back to the beach base, reducing the risk that abandoned stores could be used by any remaining enemy personnel. From the Japanese perspective, the aftermath was structured around extraction and accountability, rather than continued contest for terrain. The detachment had crossed to Ferguson Island in landing craft, then transferred to a larger warship for movement back toward Japanese bases. This sequence showed the practical limits of Japanese control in the area at that time. The ability to recover personnel at night existed, but sustaining an outpost against an occupying force with local air coverage did not. Japanese records of the episode treated it as the recovery of a stranded force and the termination of an exposed position, not as a continuing mission to hold Goodenough. The island's civilian population experienced the aftermath through displacement management and gradual return. During the period of air attacks and ground patrols, several hundred islanders moved to neighboring islands, where Australian Wartime Administration personnel organized temporary shelter and food support. Once the Australian garrison concluded that organized Japanese forces had departed and patrol routes were stabilized, the immediate conditions for return improved. Even then, the return process was constrained by continued military movement, the risk of unexploded ordnance near tracks and former firing positions, and uncertainty about isolated enemy individuals. Withdrawal and rotation on the Allied side occurred in stages rather than as a single departure. The 212th Infantry Battalion remained on Goodenough through late 1942, balancing garrison duties with redeployment demands from the Boone-Agona front. Over time, responsibility for the island shifted from a landing force posture built around beach defense and patrol contact to a garrison posture focused on security, warning functions, and engineering reconnaissance. When the battalion finally left the island on the 28th of December 1942, it did so as part of broader operational requirements elsewhere, leaving behind a smaller presence to maintain control and prevent reoccupation. The end of the battle also did not end all Japanese presence. Isolated individuals remained, some dying from disease and others captured later, which meant the island remained under intermittent security search well after October 1942. This reality shaped the immediate post-combat environment. Neither side could treat the island as fully resolved on the day the main detachment left. For Allied forces, the aftermath was therefore a continuing process of confirming absence, reducing risk to civilians, and turning a short operation into durable control without diverting large forces from the main New Guinea campaign. In the wider New Guinea campaign, the lasting significance of the Goodenough Island fighting lay less in its scale than in how it altered the operating environment along the Milne-Bay-Bouna Sea corridor. Once the island was under Allied control, it removed a location that could be used for observation, short-range harassment of light shipping, or as a staging point for small craft movements between the D'Entrecasteaux Islands and the Papuan mainland. This reduced uncertainty for Allied coastal traffic, supporting later operations at Oro Bay and along the Bouna-Sanananda front, where supply tonnage and evacuation capacity were persistent constraints. The occupation also created infrastructure options that did not exist before October 1942. Reconnaissance by accompanying U.S. Army Air Forces and engineer officers identified suitable sites near Vivigani and Wataluma. Local labor cleared an emergency fighter strip at Vivigani, measuring about 4,000 feet by 100 feet, initially intended as a landing option and forward support point rather than a full base. Plans to expand Vivigani into a heavy bomber airfield were assigned to the 1st Battalion, 91st Engineer General Service Regiment, but the withdrawal of the American engineers to Port Moresby postponed the larger program. In 1943, with a more stable garrison and construction capacity, RAAF Works elements, including No. 7 Mobile Works Squadron, expanded dispersal and field facilities, integrating the airfield into the growing Allied base network that supported operations toward New Britain and the wider isolation of Rabaul. Another legacy was doctrinal and institutional. The landing under Operation Drake is often treated in Australian military history as the Army's first amphibious operation of the Second World War. It occurred under tight constraints: limited lift, no rehearsal time, restricted heavy weapons, and fragile communications, with each of these factors shaping outcomes as directly as enemy fire. Subsequent Australian amphibious and coastal operations in the theater drew practical lessons from this pattern: the need for reliable beachhead communications, the vulnerability of casualty handling and supply points to air attack, and the risk of splitting landing forces without assured coordination in jungle terrain. For the Japanese side, the episode illustrates a different operational lesson: the distinction between tactical delay and strategic sustainability. Tsukioka's detachment used prepared ground to slow in advance and impose losses, but its condition after weeks of isolation meant that holding the island indefinitely was not a feasible mission without sustained resupply and reinforcement. The evacuation on October 24th to 26th showed that, even under Allied air pressure, night movement and extraction could preserve a large share of a stranded force, converting a potentially terminal situation into a recoverable manpower outcome. In Japanese terms, the event became an example of risk management, limiting further naval exposure in contested waters while retrieving personnel where possible. For civilians, the legacy was immediate and local. Air activity and ground patrols triggered the flight of about 600 islanders to Ferguson Island, and the return process depended on the restoration of security and routine movement. Even after the main fighting ended, The continued presence of isolated Japanese soldiers and the hazards of a militarized environment meant that, after the battle, did not translate into instant normality. In historical memory, Goodenough Island is frequently overshadowed by larger and more prolonged engagements in the same period, such as Milne Bay and the Bunagona fighting. Yet its significance can be traced in concrete terms. It secured an operating space, enabled later base construction at Viviani, and provided an early test case of joint movement, limited amphibious lift, and rapid transition from combat to garrison tasks in a theater where logistics, terrain, and air threat shaped outcomes as much as battlefield strength.